What a remarkable volume we're standing in architecturally. What a remarkable space. Let's imagine for a moment that it is space. For those of you at the back, that looks like a pale blue dot. But that's us. That's our home. That's our one and only home. It's the only one we've got. It's where all of our species has lived and died. Everyone. Every single human. It's where we breathe. It's where we eat, we laugh, we cry, we love, we hate. And as far as we know, together with all the other wonderful life on Earth, we are the only known life forms in the universe. And we've got nowhere else to go. We are one species on one planet with one big problem and one last chance to sort it out. We have declared war on our one and only home. We've set our house on fire. So we, that's you and I, that's all of us, need to lead the UK on an immediate route to recovery. So we need action. Hope comes from action. Hope comes from courage. So please, listen and learn from the scientists and experts who are about to tell you the facts. The facts. I beseech you to hear their truth, the truth that they are going to tell you.
As we've just heard, the information that we're going to be looking at is extremely serious, urgent, and it affects us all here in the UK. That is why we're calling this a national emergency briefing. Today is about facing an escalating polycrisis instead of pretending that it isn't happening. And we're not doing that to be depressing. Quite the opposite. In the words of James Baldwin, human rights campaigner, nothing can be changed until it is faced. And we need that change now. Sometimes I've wondered why I keep going pushing on this agenda, and sometimes I've despaired at where things are heading. And there's some difficult news in here, and we're going to face it together, and we're in it for the long haul.
I'm speaking today in my professional capacity as an academic at Newcastle University. In September 2024, Storm Boris caused record-breaking rainfall across 6 countries in Central and Eastern Europe. It overwhelmed rivers, it caused multiple dam collapses and destructive flood waves, and damages exceeded €2 billion. Storm Boris isn't an isolated case. Europe's been hit again and again by severe floods in recent years. Do you remember Germany in 2021? Nearly 200 people were killed in one of the deadliest European floods in decades. The same weather system triggered those dangerous flash floods in London. And in Valencia in October 2024, 3/4 of a metre of rain fell in just 24 hours. It caused flooding that claimed 220 lives. Storm Daniel in 2023 inundated Greece. It flooded 1/5 of its agricultural land. And then it intensified into a medicane, that's a Mediterranean hurricane, and it killed over 5,000 people in Libya. These events are not warnings of what might happen in the future. They're actually examples of what's happening right now. Every year we delay urgent investment in resilience and emissions reductions. The window for successful action gets smaller. But we can imagine a better future. First, we need urgent action to cut emissions. It's sobering when you realise that this is the least extreme climate you will experience in your lifetime. I'll let that sink in. Until we stop burning fossil fuels, extreme weather will continue to get worse. So cutting emissions isn't enough. It isn't a choice. We must also adapt to protect people and livelihoods. And that means upgrading flood defences and drainage to cope with more intense rainfall, retrofitting homes to withstand extreme heat and cold, stress testing critical infrastructure so it keeps going during extreme events, investing in modern early warning systems to save lives, and building local resilience in communities. So to close, extreme weather is not a future problem. It's already changed significantly. It's getting worse fast, and we're not prepared. But we have an opportunity for change. We have the science to understand what's happening, the tools to build resilience, and we know what works. But what we need now is the courage to commit to urgent action. Thank you.
I want to start by framing the problem as I see it. And it's very much that the CO2 concentrations in the environment, in the atmosphere, are rising at unprecedented rates. If we measure the concentration of carbon dioxide in parts per million, and we look at that across the last, say, 800,000 years and compare that with today, we see a plot that looks like this. Now that has a variation in that of about 100 parts per million going up and down, basically related to the ice ages. If we then focus in on the last 10,000 years, and that's the time when human societies have really flourished, what we see then is a pathway that is much more stable in carbon dioxide. The variation has only been about 20 parts per million in that period of time. And so we've had a very stable temperature and a very stable climate during the flourishing of our societies. If we then look at the end of this, and so this is really where we began to burn fossil fuels in about 1850-ish. And we were about 280 parts per million by volume at that particular time. And if we look at that where we are today, we're now at 424 parts per million, almost overnight. We've gone to these ridiculously high levels, and it's rising rapidly every single year. We've driven temperatures up, approaching 1.5 degrees C warmer than at the time of the Industrial Revolution. If we don't stop burning fossil fuels, the temperatures will just keep rising. This idea that we cut fossil fuel use doesn't help. We have to eliminate fossil fuels, or the temperatures will just keep going up. The way we've set it up at the moment, the way the society is going at the moment, we're going to see a rise of about 2 degrees centigrade or so by the middle of this century. That's very hard to imagine that we're going to be any less than that. But there's now a small but very real risk that we could hit 4 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. Now, the prospects of 3 and 4 degrees centigrade of warming are absolutely dire. I mean, we cannot risk that at all. It is an extreme and unstable climate, far beyond any safe zone that has nurtured our civilization. And we're going to be seeing unprecedented societal and ecological collapse at these sorts of levels. We can see escalating geopolitical instability and rising military tensions. And there will be no real economy to talk about. There's no reduction in GDP. We'll be looking at systemic collapse. Science tells us about the scale and the timeline of cutting our emissions. Remember, these are political commitments that we've made. The science tells us it is the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that gives us the rise in temperature. And it also gives us the global carbon budget, the total amount of carbon dioxide that we can emit if we're going to stay within our Paris commitments. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, then quantify these carbon budgets for us to give us a really useful policy tool here. Now, I've updated the IPCC's last report up to 2026, January 2026, and with the improvements we've seen in the science since then. And if you play out the numbers here, we see that we can emit somewhere between 130 and 530 billion tons of carbon dioxide for 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. That means very little to most of us, I would think. That's 3 to 13 years of current emissions. 3 to 13 years. And remember, emissions are rising every single year. If we were to reduce emissions from January the 1st at a set rate every year, for 1.5 degrees centigrade, now globally, we would have to cut emissions by 20% every single year. And even for 2 degrees centigrade, it's 8% every year. That's 3 percentage points higher than the reduction that occurred at the peak of the COVID epidemic. That's for 2 degrees centigrade. If we drew straight lines to zero emissions from January the 1st, then we'd have to be zero emissions for 1.5 by about 2030 and zero emissions globally by about 2050, as long as we follow that straight line down. At the moment, every single month, we're using up the budget at about 2.7, for 1.5, about 2.7% of that budget every single month. And for 2 degrees centigrade, it's still 0.7% every month. I've greyed out the 1.5 here with a very heavy heart. I don't know any scientist, if you take them away from a microphone, who thinks staying below 1.5 is any longer a viable target. That is a very depressing statement to have to make. So I also want to add to this a cautionary note, and this will be touched on, I think, later. There's emerging evidence that we're warming faster than we have been previously. There's what we call higher climate sensitivity. The CO2 we put in the atmosphere is not being absorbed to quite the same level as it was previously by the biosphere. There's also, as we're cleaning up the air, taking out the air pollution, we're removing the cooling that the aerosols have provided us as well. So this only escalates the urgent need for emergency level policies. Unfortunately, in this, there is no good news. We also committed in Paris to reduce our emissions on the basis of equity. And that means we take the global carbon budget and we divide that, using the language of the Paris Agreement, between developed and developing countries. We can then ask the question of developed countries' carbon budget, how much we can emit, basically how many tons of fossil fuels we can burn. What does the UK get? Building on some peer-reviewed work from a few years ago and updating that to January this year, then we can say for the UK we can emit somewhere around about 2 to 2.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Again, that means very little to many of us. That's 7 years of current UK emissions. Remember, this is for 2 degrees centigrade, not for 1.5, for 2. If we were to reduce emissions from January the 1st for the UK, we'd need reductions of about 13% every single year if we were to stay within the 2 degrees C carbon budget. This is the same pretty much for all industrialised countries. If we were to draw a straight line to zero, remember that means zero fossil fuel production, zero fossil fuels, we're talking about 2039. This is a very different agenda of what you normally get to see. Just do the maths, just do the science. Against this fairly depressing backdrop, I want to say, well, what would mitigation, what would reducing our emissions have to look like? And this is my main focus of work, really. Well, firstly, technology, and I'm pleased about this as an engineer, technology is absolutely a prerequisite of delivering on Paris. But after choosing to fail on climate change by our leaders for the last 30 years, it is now far from sufficient. We also need, and this is going to be very difficult for many of us here, profound shifts in our social norms. Now, too late for non-radical futures. I see no way out of revolutionary rates of change in how we, particularly groups of us, live today. The choice is between a deep, rapid and fair decarbonisation of modern society, an organised-ish technical and social revolution, or ongoing rhetoric and delay as temperatures exceed dangerous for all, and they will have revolutionary scales of change that will be both chaotic and violent. I'm going to close with a quote from Robert Unger, Brazilian politician and philosopher. At every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it will be different.
I'll walk you through why, if we carry on the current trajectory to 3 or maybe 4 degrees of warming later this century, then we'll definitely be in a national emergency, because we'll be at a high level of likelihood of crossing a tipping point in the climate that will make this country a very different place and less habitable place to be. And that we've only really got one credible way out of that kind of risk and trouble. If you're wondering what a tipping point is, you could just lean back on your chair to that balance point where you know that a small change is going to make a big difference to your state or your fate. There'll be a self-propelling change from one stable state of the system to another. What I'm doing in the little movie here is a bit more subtle. We've got a system that's got 2 different stable states like the chair. It's in the one on the left, but we're forcing it in a way that that initial state gets less and less stable, less resilient, until at some point some strong amplifiers in the system support a self-propelling change from one state to another. What are the qualities of that tipping point change? Well, it's pretty abrupt, as you can see. It's self-propelling. I didn't have to keep forcing the system. It would just carry on under its own momentum. And it's pretty difficult to reverse once it's underway. Now, tipping points can happen in all kinds of complex systems, including the climate and the economy and societies. There's a bunch of tipping points in the climate that I've spent 20-odd years kind of documenting and telling everybody about. There's plenty, sadly, of evidence that as we'll see, that we're heading towards several of these tipping points. They also interact. We're living in a beautiful, complex, almost living Earth system where tipping one thing can affect the likelihood of tipping another. And unfortunately, this system is wired up in a way where it's more often the case that tipping one thing makes tipping another more likely. So we recently published our Global Tipping Points Report 2025, telling the world that whilst we're here at about 1.4 degrees centigrade of global warming at the moment and heading to 1.5 around 2030, we've already crossed a tipping point for the world's coral reef ecosystems that support the livelihoods of around 500 million people and protect many coastlines from rising sea levels and storm surges. We met in Belém in the Amazon in the knowledge that we are now, as we head over 1.5 degrees C of global warming in the near future, at risk of tipping a loss of the Amazon rainforest that isn't just a catastrophe for nature, but it adds a lot of carbon to the atmosphere and removes a lot of reflective cloud cover, so it adds to global warming for all of us. But I want to concentrate on the things that are in the middle, some big risks we're already running of tipping points where we'd essentially stop two key parts of what a process we call the formation of deep water in the North Atlantic Ocean. And then this causes ultimately a tipping point and a thing that we esoterically call the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC for short. But you really want to know about this, so just remember the acronym AMOC. We've all heard of the Gulf Stream, and hopefully you recognize that as part of the red warm water flow heading northeastwards across the North Atlantic. But you can see it's part of this bigger loop, a sort of red to blue loop, which is the great overturning, we call it, circulation of the Atlantic. So this red thing is a surface current heading northwards, transporting masses of heat to where we are and giving us our nice, mild, equable climate, especially winters. But you see, either side of Greenland, something happens called deep water formation. Those waters that are heading north, they're losing heat and they're evaporating fresh water to the atmosphere. That makes them colder and saltier and therefore denser. And either side of Greenland, they get so dense that these waters sink from the top of the ocean to thousands of meters down. And that propels the blue path, which is cold water heading back thousands of meters down in the bottom of the Atlantic and closing the loop. If you lose the deep water formation, you can tip off this great overturning, and I'll show you in a minute what that will do to our climate. We already know this circulation is weakening. We know it's switched on and off without human activities 25 times during the last ice age. We know the dramatic changes in climate that wrought to our part of the world. And unfortunately, this circulation can pass and does pass a tipping point in a bunch of the state-of-the-art climate models that we run. I'll just show you an example of one of them. In this one, it's happened at around 2 degrees centigrade of global warming. On the right, you're seeing a remarkable comeback of the Arctic sea ice cover that happens if we cross this tipping point, with the sea ice reaching down to the wash and covering most of the North Sea by February each winter. On the left, there's some information about what the decadal winter climate extremes will be if we've crossed this tipping point. In London, it's minus 20 degrees C and 3 frozen months of the year. And in Edinburgh, it's minus 30 degrees C and 5.5 frozen months of the year. And yet the summers will still be hotter than today because it's a 2 degrees warmer world, not a 1.4 degrees warmer world. So the seasonality of the UK, the climate, is like nothing we've ever seen before. It's radically increased. My closing case to you is going to be that requires a radical acceleration of action towards zero emissions. And the only way we can really convince ourselves that that's credible is if I can convince you that there are also what I call positive tipping points where the change towards zero emissions technologies and behaviors can itself become self-accelerating. So it's just like the original movie. There are different stable states of the economy and society. We're in this predominantly fossil-fueled state of the economy, but we can all picture a different economy and society powered by clean, renewable energy and a bunch of other things besides. There's certainly a barrier or a hilltop between those two states, but we've already seen how in some sectors and in some nations, how actions, including policy actions, can lower the hilltop, can destabilize the fossil fuels status quo, and can activate amplifiers within the system that then create a self-propelling change from the old emitting, dirty way of doing things to the clean, low emissions way of doing things.
Nature is not a nice to have. It's not a luxury. It is critical national infrastructure. When we destroy and degrade it, we expose this country to escalating risks: floods, fires, heat waves, food insecurity, and economic instability. When we protect and restore it, we can build resilience, create jobs, and strengthen the foundations of a safe, happy, and prosperous community and country. We are facing a national emergency, not only because the climate is changing, but because the living systems that regulate that climate, protect our homes and feed our people, are breaking down here in one of the most nature-depleted nations on earth. So the facts are sobering. The UK ranks in the bottom 10% of countries globally on the Biodiversity Intactness Index, with only about half of its biodiversity remaining. Across the UK, monitored wildlife populations have declined by around 19% since the 1970s, and 1 in 6 of our species is now at risk of extinction. Now, that's not just a loss of beauty or heritage, critically important though that is. It's also a loss of function, the pollination of crops, the filtering of water, the regulation of floods and disease. Only 14% of rivers in England are in good ecological health under our own water framework regulations. Chemical pollution, sewage discharge, soil erosion, agricultural runoff are choking the arteries of our landscapes. When rivers die, when rivers fail, so does our resilience to droughts, floods, and water scarcity for agriculture and industry. Our peatlands, which store phenomenal amounts of carbon, are mostly degraded. Instead of locking away carbon for millennia, they are emitting millions of tons of CO2 into our atmosphere a year, increasing wildfire risk. Meanwhile, only 7% of our woodlands are healthy, 3% of our lands and 8% of our waters are considered effectively protected for nature.
I'm going to tell you about a threat that will affect everyone in this room, every family in this country, and every constituent. A threat for which we are woefully unprepared. And I'm talking about the increasing pressure on global food supplies in the face of accelerating climate change and nature loss. This is what happens when food systems fail. Empty supermarket shelves, people queuing for hours for food, protests and civil unrests. In Syria, drought-driven agricultural collapse preceded civil war, and we've seen climate fingerprints on many of the civilizational collapses in history. For generations, a stable climate has given us reliable harvests, but that era, as we've heard, is gone. We are facing an increasingly chaotic system. So we're talking droughts, floods, wildfires, and heat extremes that are all increasing. The good news is that the research is crystal clear on what we need to do. And, fortunately, it's healthier for us. We need a great food transformation built on 4 main pillars: shifting to plant-rich diets, reducing food waste, improving production, and increasing climate resilience. But one of these pillars is much bigger than the others: a shift to healthy, plant-rich diets. In the UK, animal agriculture occupies around 85% of total agricultural land, shown in green here proportionally. And animals drive most of the problems that I just mentioned. And this is just simply not resilient, because in a climate and nature-constrained world, with a shrinking agricultural safe space, this is simply unsustainable. Research from our team and many others across the UK show that healthy, sustainable diets can still include some meat and dairy, just far less of it. So we're thinking about a red meat burger once every 2 weeks, which is still within the range of diets of many British families. It means a chicken breast once a week, and a quarter of a pint of dairy each day, maybe a bit of cheese. Now, I know this can be politically difficult to talk about, but we have to be straight with people about the choices ahead, because if we don't lead this change on the front foot, we'll be forced into this change anyway as food shocks intensify and as animals are hit harder by climate change than the crops. So we face a choice. We can continue with business as usual, watching our food systems crumble, watching the costs rise, our resilience erode, and then bracing ourselves for political and civil unrest. Or we can act now to improve our health, our environment, our overall livelihoods, our communities, along with improving our ability to roll with the punches of climate change. We'll look back and wonder why we didn't make these changes sooner.
I work in climate change, but I'm an NHS lifer. I'm a barefoot doctor working in a North London intensive care unit. And my day job is emergencies, whether it's global pandemics or 7/7 events such as this, terrorist attacks, or the more mundane, the people who come in acutely unwell on any one of the days of the week. I know what an emergency looks like, and I know how you respond to an emergency. And you don't respond to emergencies with talk and homeopathy. You respond with genuine action. These are the sorts of patients I deal with. And it's not just that I recognise an emergency and what to do. I have to have honest conversations. Those honest conversations might be, there is nothing I can do to help your loved one or you, and that your loved one or you are going to die. Sometimes it's, this is what we must do to save your life. Are you up for the pain and suffering that that will take to get you to that end? And I'm used to having conversations about risk and hazard. The risk of, let's say, a lifestyle, such as smoking, that might be bad for you, to say, the risks, the likelihood of a bad thing happening or going up by you doing this, I would strongly suggest we help you not to do that thing. But I'm also used to explaining what the hazard of that is. Not just the chance of it happening, but what the bad thing looks like. The suffering that it might cause you, and the fact that if that bad thing happens, I might not actually be able to do anything about it. Well, I can talk you through what we originally plotted in the Lancet Countdown, which we now publish. It's an over 50-country, 128 scientist report coming out every single year, and it maps 20 indicators of the health hazards of climate change. This year's report, 12 of those 20 broke records of hazard. They get worse every year. Why? Well, because we end up with these sorts of consequences for climate change. You've had many of them alluded to earlier on. And those cause downstream impacts, such as these. Those cause health consequences, and you can start mapping what those are. There are changes, for instance, to respiratory health, to asthma or COPD coming from fires, for instance, or high pollen burden. We get changes in communicable disease. But I'm guessing most of you looking at that aren't terribly frightened by that. And if I'm completely honest, neither am I. Because whilst we get those things coming here now, and whilst they're hitting people abroad very hard, we're not really seeing them. And humans aren't wired to manage indeterminate, medium-term risk from activities they find currently pleasurable. That's why use of cigarettes, drugs, unprotected sex, alcohol, all continue, because they're all great fun now. Although, as one of my fellows once said, not necessarily in that order. And they're associated with risk. This is the problem. As Professor Sir Michael Marmot pointed out, the social determinants of health aren't just an adjunct to health. They're the main driver of disease, suffering, and death. And that doesn't matter if you're in a poor, resource-poor country, or you're in a wealthier nation such as ours. The major driver of disease we see is due to the social determinants of health. Come visit my intensive care unit, you will see that writ big. And this is what scares the living daylights out of me. Because these sorts of climate impacts, of which we've just heard from other experts, drive catastrophic downstream changes which affect our socioeconomic systems. in this sort of way. Paul alluded to the fact that the Kazakh grain crop collapse and then the heat waves around Syria led to the insurgent masses moving into the Syrian capital, destabilizing it, the triggering of Arab Springs and so forth, very well documented. You're going to hear more about that later. But these are the problems. Without a functioning economy, without food supply available to us, we cannot run a health service, we cannot have health.
The MOD is now looking at environmental impacts with a team working on climate security, energy self-sufficiency for our forces, and how they can adapt to a rapidly changing planet. The Chief of Defence Staff is engaged. Other countries and NATO are doing the same, factoring climate into national security. Why? Because the threat picture is shifting faster than we expected and faster than we anticipated. In this more complicated and contested world, we have had a clear steer. And whilst you may not be able to read all of that, they're direct quotes from the Strategic Defence Review. We must be better prepared for the threats coming towards us in this country. And they are not just military. They're threats to the fabric of this great country of ours, which require action. The Strategic Defence Review calls for a whole-of-society approach.
First, I'll say why we should transition, but this has been said before. Nick Stern said it in 2006. He said it again in his new book. The costs of action massively, the costs of inaction are massively outweighed by the cost of action. I think I said that the wrong way around. The case is overwhelming. Even the most cautious estimates of cost and benefits, proving that was so important because our economic models were not flashing red in the face of the climate and nature crisis. Models are simplifications, they help us answer particular questions, but they don't include everything that our economy depends on, and they did not include the environment. They didn't include a functioning finance system, if you remember that. Those things are just assumed to be there. So changes or failures are a major blind spot. Now, the OBR, the Bank of England, the Green Finance Institute, they're all correcting that now. They're all aware that climate and nature is a major systemic risk for the economic and finance system. So why are we still not acting? Why is it so hard? Let's deal with the bad arguments. First one, we can't afford net zero. Yes, debt levels are high because of the financial crisis and because of COVID. And that's true that for lots of things that we need in this transition have got upfront costs and long-term benefits. But the economics doesn't change because of the fiscal situation we're in. The investment the UK needs to make to stay on the CCC's balanced pathway is equivalent to about £4 billion a year. That's 0.2% of GDP. And we can start seeing that to pay back from 2041. Even if other countries don't act, that would generate returns for the UK. The majority of that investment would be paid by the private sector. With the right incentives and policy, they would cover 40 to 90% of what is needed. And the public sector share could be funded by national banks and asset-backed lending, where the economics stack up like they do here. Plus, delaying until you can afford it assumes that costs won't increase or that it'll be cheaper later, and that isn't true. Learning by doing delivers major savings. The Oxford Martin School and the Smith School have been looking at this in the context of the energy transition. They compared a fast, a slow, and no transition, and faster is cheaper. The faster transition saves $12 trillion compared to staying on fossil fuels. That is more than twice the saving of a slow transition. Bad argument two, the UK can't do this by itself. The UK can't do this by itself. It's true, the UK can't solve the whole climate and nature crisis by itself, but that's not what is happening. Others are acting. In the last 10 years, we have seen a 7-fold increase in national climate policy around the world. Plus, the best way to get others to act is to act yourself. Leaders drive innovation and make it easier for others to follow. Just let's look at the last 10 years. Globally, wind is being built out 3 times the pace we thought it would be in 2015. Solar installations are 15 times faster than we thought they would be. EVs were expected to have 20% of the market in 2030, have hit that last year, and they're now expected to double market share by 2030. And because faster is cheaper, the cost of the whole UK transition is now 73% cheaper than we thought it would be just 5 years ago. So I'm not going to promise to you the UK will have a leading role in every single part of the green transition, but we will increase our chance of being a designer, a high-value component producer, a project developer if we're involved at the start and if we're working with other countries bilaterally and plurilaterally so we can create the scale necessary for those positive tipping points that Tim talked about in key areas like energy, transport and agriculture.
Thankfully, the evidence is clear that an energy system powered by renewables will indeed be more affordable and more economically secure. I understand that it may feel at this point like getting to an electrified energy system anchored in renewable energy requires too much planning, too much infrastructure, too much investment. And so I want to end by reminding you that after the discovery of North Sea gas in the 1960s, the British state executed a massive conversion of our energy infrastructure to accommodate natural gas over gas coming from coal. Over about a decade, we retrofitted or replaced more than 30 million appliances, constructed a vast new transmission network, and rebuilt regional gas distribution. When the opportunity for a vastly superior energy system arose, we grasped it. Of course, although it was done in a way at the time that was fair for consumers, we all know that the shift away from coal was devastating for miners and for their communities. This time around, we not only have the opportunity for a better energy system, one that is safer, cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable, but we also know how to get to that ambitious goal in a way that is genuinely just for ordinary people. There is no bigger prize than that, so we can and must seize that opportunity again. Thank you very much.
We are not safe. This is an emergency. Now is the time for courage and to put trust in the public. The UK has a track record of uniting to face difficult challenges. Now is the time to do this again. Thank you.